Hi everyone, welcome to the Wheel of Mind, the Wheel of Time point of view reread podcast. This season, we're reading Matt Cawthon's perspective. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 21, our final Matt episode in Crown of Swords, because we decided last minute to cram some extra chapters in here compared to our previous reading list. I'm your co-host, Lajara Dane of the White Aja.
Hi, I'm Giskel Simris, a scholar from Ilion. Today we're going to hit you with a 4-chapter summary, finishing Matt Cawthon's appearances in A Crown of Swords. And as always, we may drop spoilers at any time, so please read the entire series before listening to this podcast. Unless you're one of those weird people who like to hear about the ending of a book before you finish it. Ugh. Anyway, on to Lajara Sadai.
Alright, so I am going to get us started with a summary of chapters 29, 37, and 38 together, because I felt like there was enough redundant information that those could be condensed into a pretty normal size summary that I normally do for one chapter. Chapter 29 is called The Festival of Birds. In this one, Matt wakes up to the dice tossing in his head again, unsure of what it could mean. He wants to go out to the Festival of Birds with Oliver to get his mind off of everything, but instead, Mat-Tylin shows up after having been away for several days. He thought he was pretty much rid of her. She has Oliver whisked off with a pretty feathered woman and proceeds to force Matt into sex at knife point after he tries to steal back his room key from her. Afterwards, she leaves him a mask as a gift, and he heads out to the festival with Beslin, Nalesian, and Brigitta. Brigitta has fun getting attention from men and pointing out pretty women to Matt. The group gets set upon by beggars who try to kill them. Turns out they're not part of the guild, because everything has to have a guild in Ebou Dar, including the beggars, so these are not legal panhandlers. After Matt and Brigitta dispatch a few of them, members of the actual guild show up to kill the interlopers, while our heroes escape back to the Rose, this bar they've been staying at. This bar they've been hanging out to watch the Rahad across the river. There, Matt learns that Beslin knows about and approves of Matt's status as Mat-Tylin's pretty, and consequently, Matt leaves the bar walking beside a random woman in shame. And thus ends Chapter 29, The Festival of Birds. So on to Chapter 37, A Note from the Palace. The next day, Matt, Elaine, and some of the kin are getting ready to go into the Rahad to get the bowl now that they finally know the location. The women are arguing about age, and it seems pretty meaningless to Matt, so he interjects and gets into an argument with Elaine. He assumed they could grab the bowl and skip town immediately. Instead, Elaine insists that they need to wait to learn how to use it, and that they might as well deal with Jacob Carradine while they're in town a bit longer. Then, Nynaeve appears on Lan's arm, and Lan explains that they got married last night on a sea folk ship, and he alludes to some strange customs without elaborating, but he also has to break the bad news that Moghedien had attacked and killed 2 bodyguards. Apparently, she has a personal grudge against Nynaeve, but Nynaeve would not explain why. Matt is confused. He's already feeling unsafe because of Mat-Tylin, and all this stuff about Moghedien is a lot to process. Beslin urges him to read a letter from the Queen in the breakfast basket he was handed earlier in the chapter. It explains that Mat-Tylin is moving him into her apartments, and that he needs to be measured for new, more revealing clothes. Matt touches his medallion and wished he had a way to protect himself against her instead of just the one power. And thus ends Chapter 37, A Note from the Palace. Chapter 38, 6 Stories, picks up with the party preparing to cross the river on a seafolk ship to reach the Rahad. Elaine notices the gift basket from last chapter, and she misinterprets it, berating Matt for pressing his intentions upon the Queen. He pulls her aside to explain, actually it's the opposite, and Elaine laughs at him. He's frustrated, and he still feels trapped, but he's worried about the women having to face Moghedien, so he offers his medallion as protection. Elaine won't take it, though. As long as Aviendha and Nynaeve are without the same protection, she will not accept that help from him. She appreciates it, though, and she thanks him for being a good subject, apologizes for laughing at him, and offers to help in any way that she can, in terms of maybe talking to Mat-Tylin. When they get to the Rahad, people watch them challengingly, but the denizens won't attack them because the party is full of wise women. They make it to the 6-story building with the storeroom, where Phaleon and Ispan, members of the Black Aja, shield Nynaeve and ambush on the stairs from behind. They insinuate that they're taking her back to Moghedien. There was also a party around back of the building that reached Elaine and some wise women and guards before Nynaeve and Matt and company could. Matt breaks away from the fight on the stairs to run up to the storeroom when he hears a scream. Elaine is injured, and there are many other injured and dead around too. A strange man who moves like liquid appears to be unharmed by anyone's counterattacks, and he seems impossible to block, and he kills people with just brutal strength. However, Mat discovers that his medallion burns the man, who ends up running away into another room and bolting the door. Nynaeve captured one of the Black Ajah, and after several rounds of healing and everybody exchanging news to kind of take stock of the casualties, including the Elysian, Elaine ends up finding the bowl, and thus ends Chapter 38, 6 stories. This is one where I like the atmosphere, like I've mentioned about a lot of others, if we're looking back at Chapter 29, when they're actually at the Festival of Birds. It's a fun scene where Mat and Brigitta get to have some fun together. You know, I like how Brigitta is enjoying a little bit of kind of innocent attention from men. She knows she's inviting it, but she's doing that on purpose, and she's just having some fun with it. And it ties back into our discussion from last week, where you were talking about how you like that the Domani explicitly train flirting, because that's something maybe we should be teaching people to do, is how to do that in a healthy, positive way. And it's also just cool that Mat has a lot of these colorful scenes in bustling cities or rowdy taverns that I think are going to translate really well to the screen. So every time we get in one of these like carnival type chapters in this series, I just really long to see it on screen and see everybody costumed. One more funny thing about the costumes is that Mat has some tension there where he's enjoying looking, but he still has this Two Rivers propriety, even though we think of him as one of the most lusty sexual characters in the series. He's still like, man, I wish she would cover up. I mean, she looks great, but my goodness, just out here in front of everybody.
Yeah, he started to tell the woman to go put some clothes on.
Yeah.
The entire thing about Suovan Night, it's just the name. Just, you know, something rowdy is about to happen. I mean, I don't know how Robert Jordan can pick out the name of a festival like this, and you know it's a little bit Mardi Gras, a little bit Brazilian parade. I mean, it just has this flair. In fact, I think of things I've seen on television about Brazil and some of the celebrations and things, and to me, it just has a lot of that flavor. And so I hope they're able to incorporate a lot of not just the people are wearing the feathers, but the beautiful color. The way some of it is so overdone with those who had enough money to do so. So, yeah, I think it could be so cinematic. It's so pretty. And I hope, I know things will be changed, but I hope a lot of this is able to be incorporated into the series without it. Anyway, yeah, we have the attack by the beggars. That is, if I'm counting it right, that's the third major attack that's been centered on Mat since Jacob Carradine saw him staying outside. And of course, he didn't know that, so he's not privy to that, but he still does not see the pattern. It's so amazing Mat can be so willfully ignorant at times. So, yeah, it just completely goes over his head that they're first trying to kidnap him, now kill him. And it's not just that Ebou Dar is a rough place, but Mat is the focus of this. And he just doesn't see that.
I think those plots against them are so easily obscured by what a dangerous place Ebou Dar is. So if this had happened anywhere else, like Cairhien or something, I think it would have been a little more obvious to him, because he is getting better at acknowledging some things. He is in denial sometimes, but not quite as bad as he used to be before about the last book. Part of it is just masked by he's having to get used to this much more violent culture than what he's used to.
Well, and it's not, or at least my opinion, it's not that Ebou Dar is that violent or dangerous for strangers. Now, for people who like to accept duels and things like that, it can be very violent. Right. But I think it's that it appears so violent to him from his perspective, from his Two Rivers upbringing, that when he sees violence that's directed at him, he just, in his mind, he just equates it with general, Ebou Dar-y, it's the way things are here. But I don't think you see that kind of violence all the time, every day, amongst people who are not trying to duel.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Right, and I think there's probably a custom surrounding their duels. Perhaps things you say or things you do, to basically show that you're willing to accept one. And just not knowing that, it just seems to him like it's random violence. People, let's just get in a knife fight. But I don't think it is that dangerous most of the time in most places. But from an outsider, from someone who grew up around sheep, this seems like just such a terrible, violent place that in his mind, he equates his attacks against him as just, it's just something that happens because Ebou Dar is so dangerous.
Right.
And I don't think he reads that yet, that, no, this is against me personally. That can kind of be played somewhat for humor, I guess. It probably is described this way in the series for that effect. Just something that we, the reader, sees that Matt doesn't. And you want to grab him and shake him. So it does keep your interest in the story, as it should. And then I like when he kind of gets uncomfortable with the direction of discussion between he and Beslin. He just kind of jumps up, just walks off, and sees a woman comes out of this building that he's been watching for days, and just kind of follows a step behind her, just following her. And then, of course, he's not privy to it, but just following that, I think it's Rihanna is the leader of the wise women there. Mm-hmm. She looks out the window and sees this man follow. And she talks about how the urge to go and check on the things they had hidden in the Rahad had just gotten overwhelming that day. But for several days, she had the urge to go check on these things. And so his Ta'veren nature had been at work for days while he's there watching this place.
Yeah.
But he didn't realize it. He had no way to know. And he'd finally just reached that boiling point just at that moment. So I like the Ta'verenness and how that all works in together.
I like how this part finally resolves. We know more about what his Ta'verenness was doing when he was having to just stare at that building and he thought nothing was happening. I didn't actually remember how that was going to resolve. I didn't remember a lot of these more, I guess, minor plot threads. I just remembered it more like they're in Ebou Dar for a long time. They can't find the bowl. I can't remember why they can't find the bowl. And then finally they do and they leave.
Yeah. Again, looking back, I thought it was just this interminable length of time.
Yeah.
And they are there a while.
Yeah, for them it's a long time.
Once the girls are gone, the Mat and the band is still there, which we'll get into in later books.
Yeah.
But it's really not that bad. To me, this is, again, the kind of the beginning of the slog in many ways. And yet in my reread right now, I'm most of the way through Winter's Heart, and I haven't seen any hint of the slog.
Yeah.
So it's, again, a lot of it is our imagination seem like it stretches that out and makes it seem worse than it is.
Yeah.
I'm very much unslogged right now.
I'm towards the end of Crown of Swords, and I think the parts that made me start to feel like it really slowed down and made the series feel a little more difficult to stay motivated to read was when a lot of new Aes Sedai start showing up. And a lot of this happens at the same time, so we meet a lot of the kin. We meet these wise women as well in Ebou Dar who are part of this kin circle, but not all of them are native Ebou Dari. And then we've got the tower where Elida is being bullied by Alviarin, and she's trying to get back at her, but ends up inadvertently launching a hunt for the Black Aja. So that point, that's where it starts to really slow down and expand for me, where we've got all these storylines that are no longer our main characters. We've got points of view from brand new people, and it just seems like so many people to keep up with at once. But now that we have finished it all the way through at least once, I think it's so much easier to keep track of the bullet points, and if you can feel a little more progress.
Yeah. I think so. I'm really enjoying my reread more than I thought I would.
Yeah.
And the audiobook version really helps me. When I read through in paper, finally beginning to end the entire series, it took several months. I think it was about 9 months.
Oh, yeah.
And I got finished and I said, I love this series so much, but I doubt I'll ever be able to dedicate that much time to going through this series again. But with my commute and the audiobooks, it's working for me. So I'm really excited about that. So a couple more points of just things that I loved about this story. One of those, Nynaeve got married. Now, of course, this happened in between, the chapters 29 and 37, yes. Yeah. But Matt's incredulity of that is just hilarious. The way he basically he keeps looking at Lan thinking, poor guy, how does he put up with with this? Because Nynaeve is the one woman, well, I say the only woman besides his sister's mother and grandmother that Mat-Tylin cannot imagine being a woman, really. He cannot look at her in that regard. Well, one of the few, I should say. I mean, he cannot imagine anyone being romantically inclined to her because they butt heads or they have butted heads so many times in the past. It seems like he could never get away with anything with her when she was Wisdom of Emmons Field.
Yeah.
He cannot picture her ever being in a good mood. It surprises him if she's happy. You just see all of these things, and just continually it becomes almost a running joke from his perspective in the story. Anytime he interacts with Lan, he just looks at Lan. It's like he's still just amazed this man can really put up with her. And I find that humor just hilarious, because it kind of gives me glimpses, of how he views her. But yeah, I thought that was just a fun part of the story. I had forgotten from my first time through the series to this reread about how Nynaeve had broken her block. And I know this is not part of the Mat perspective.
Wow. Yeah.
But it's just one of those things. I had completely forgotten that. So when she's on the boat, that Mogadine just cuts in half with balefire, and she sinks, and I'm just like, how did she get out of this? Because I had no memory of how it happened. I knew she would survive it, but I didn't recall that that's where she broke her block and went on. Up until this point, the best way I could describe Nynaeve and her ability to channel and trying to get around her block was a quote from the first Avengers movie, when things get really out of hand, and Dr. David Banner does not want to become the Hulk. He does not want to become the Hulk, but there's this point he has to. And I think it's Iron Man, if someone says, I think you're going to have to get angry. And Dr. Banner looks back at him and said, that's my secret. I'm always angry. Boom, he turns into the Hulk. And that has been Nynaeve up to this point. Sometimes she gets frustrated because she can't channel, and gets angry enough to channel. If nothing else, she starts thinking about either Lan not being there, and she gets angry enough to channel, or Mat and the things he gets into, and she's angry enough to channel. So it's just almost like she is always angry enough to channel, except there's one or two times when it's convenient for the plot for her to not be able to channel. But I do like the fact, she finally, in between these chapters that you summarized, she finally broke that block, and she's has a little more freedom to be Aes Sedai, which is pretty awesome. And then we get this other thing that is, to me, as mind-blowing and incredible as Nynaeve getting married, and that is, Mat walks up to Elaine before they go into the Rahad and offers her his medallion.
Yeah, that was such a touching moment.
Right. Oh my gosh, he really did that. Because it's such a small thing in the story in some ways, until we've broken down Mat's character and the interactions, and, her offering to let him have it back after she studies it every evening, before they begin this trip. And, just the tension that comes about because of that. And so, I really love that. That shows how much he's grown and matured, how much she has that she declines the offer, because, if Nynaeve and the other women around can't have one, it wouldn't be fair for her to have it. And let's be honest, we don't even know if she could channel were she wearing it. She might not be able to. It might, might be more of a hindrance than a help to her. And then we discover how he really needed it in the fight against the Golem.
Oh, yeah.
A big turning point in this story, to me, such a small thing, such a small gesture, but, that means the world, because the price he paid for that.
Yeah.
That Yashandara, and for him to offer to let her wear it that was monumental.
Yeah, that is really huge. It's one of the points I marked out too. It's incredibly sweet considering that she was pretty rude to him right before that. And he moves on from it quickly and immediately surrenders the medallion. So it shows how committed he is to keeping his friends safe. And even though he complains about them so much to himself, he's constantly complaining about Elaine, and he's constantly complaining about Nynaeve, although now he's learned he has to keep that to himself or else he risks getting in trouble with Lan. So I'm just so glad again. I know I've said this in previous episodes, but I'm so happy that Brigitta and Aviendha have built those bridges to allow Mat's relationship with Elaine to improve. I wish we had the same with Nynaeve, but it's just more that he's intimidated into silence, and that's how the peace is kept.
Right.
But yeah, I loved that moment as well. And I had forgotten that this was the book where Lan and Nynaeve get married, and so I remembered Mashiara. I remember how the moment and how she broke her block and everything. But it's just good timing for us to be covering this stuff right around now, because my wedding anniversary is tomorrow.
Congratulations!
Thank you.
Yeah.
I also, I guess you could call it my water bonding ceremony. That's what I've been calling it on
Yes.
Twitter, saying it's
Yes.
coming up soon.
Well.
Yeah. It's funny how most of the weddings in this series are similar to mine, and that they're sort of hastily put together, and they're never a very large affair. They're all like very rushed and just have like the minimum possible legal people present.
Right.
I just think it's kind of funny. I guess it's because the end of the world, it's the end of the world, and people are like, well, we got to hurry up and get married because we don't know when we'll have the chance to do things, the right way.
Yeah, there's a little touch of that, but as well, today with big elaborate weddings being kind of the expected standard or the norm, that's a fairly new trend. That's a fairly new phenomenon. Accepting royalty and people like that.
Yeah.
Most weddings were just quiet affairs. You meet, like you said, there's minimum legal requirements, and you just get married. It's the commitment and the love that's important, not the huge elaborate ceremony. But the huge elaborate expensive ceremonies have, mostly within my lifetime, have become the standard and the norm.
Oh, yeah, I just remember my father-in-law not even knowing what a registry was, and I know he's probably around 15 years older than you, so I think you're right, and that it's probably been during your lifetime that American wedding culture has become what it is. But I think you were also about to say that there's probably exceptions in other places. I think, so there's a certain kind of Western European and American wedding culture, and they may differ some by religious tradition, but I know in some places like India, weddings do tend to be pretty big. Like, you invite the whole neighborhood and you have to feed a village practically in many cultures.
You're right. I was thinking of Western culture, but you're right. Yeah, among different places, there are big exceptions to that. But yeah, thank you for that, bringing that up.
Yeah. One more point I had about backing up a little bit, because we were talking about some of chapter 38, backing up some to 37. One moment that I found really funny was when Matt interrupted the conversation that he found boring when the women were arguing about age and stuff, because the Aes Sedai don't believe how old the kin say they are. Uh-huh. And I really just love that, because it's not the first time that Matt has interrupted a conversation that he finds boring. He did that at the end of The Dragon Reborn when Moiraine was explaining bubbles of evil and stuff. I do sympathize with him about this conversation, though, about the kin in this book and in the future ones, because I never really found the age mystery all that compelling. It might have been because the live blog that I was reading along with, even though they were a first-time reader, they also worked out the mystery of the Oath Rod and everything very early on. So for a long time, I felt that the character's knowledge was lagging way behind mine, and it was a little frustrating on that first read-through. But in this book, is even aside from that being a little bit boring to me, something that I found interesting about this part of the plot is we see a little bit of a tone shift. In this book, we start to see very strong emotional reactions when we meet the kin and when they meet Aes Sedai and they both find out secrets about each other. They have these really exaggerated emotional reactions that you haven't seen from Aes Sedai before that feel kind of silly to me and gave me a sense that maybe I shouldn't be taking this series quite as seriously. Maybe it's a little lighter hearted than I thought, because they're always fainting and stuff. Aes Sedai and kin just start fainting all over the place here in the last 10% of Crown of Swords. Yes. And so it makes it hard for me to imagine it in live action. I'm like, they're not going to be fainting like this in the TV show. This is just really hard for me to even picture. Right. So it makes more sense if I imagine it almost like anime, where the reactions are just over the top like that, and I can sort of, it makes more sense to me in that framework. But I'm like, if this is live action and I'm imagining these real people just fainting when they hear surprising news, I have a hard time computing that.
Right. And especially when Robert Jordan spent such a great amount of time in the first, say, 3 books building up the mystique of the Aes Sedai. Yes. They are, always have composure. They're so wise. All of these things. Their long lives, just the way they pull the strings to control kings and queens and move the fate of kingdoms. So he takes all this time to build them up, and then he spends the rest of the series tearing them down again. You see them having less influence. You see the kinswomen, having more influence here. with their longer lifespans and the wisdom. You see, of course, it began with the Aiel wise women, who were basically just they had revered Aes Sedai until they got to know them, and then they berate them for being so weak. And there's no dreamwalkers among them. They're weak in the power. All of these things. And very similarly with the kinswomen, they just adored and revered Aes Sedai and had for hundreds of years as individuals. But then when they got to know them, then they start losing all respect for them. And a lot of that is because of I would say, the selfish interpolitical machinations especially of the divided tower, but among many of the Aes Sedai, where they have so lost focus of what they're about as a group that they've become very ineffective. And so people who had revered them at a distance, they get up close to them and they've just lost all respect for them whatsoever. But it does seem odd to me. Robert Jordan spent time building them up and then spends the rest of the series, with very few exceptions, tearing them back down again. They go from being...
I think that's a good way of putting it. And it is interesting that it starts to happen here just right in the middle of the series.
Right. Well, like I say, it began, I guess, kind of early with the wise ones and
oh yeah, you're right.
On, but it took a while because their first interaction with an Aes Sedai was with Moiraine, who did in most ways exemplify what an Aes Sedai should be, and she was very accepting of their culture, willing to go to Rodion, to be like a wise one in many ways and emulate them rather than try to be superior to them. But the other Aes Sedai seems like they're just incapable of that. They have this superior attitude, and before you know, their balloon is deflated.
Yeah.
I don't know really what that has to do with Mat.
Not a lot, I guess.
Imagine that. We went off on a tangent. That never happens on this show.
Well, I think I started it with just Mat and me finding the same conversation boring. I sympathized with him, and then it just went on from there. It really spun off.
Oh, yeah, it's one of those things I just launched into, and I can't help myself. But anyway.
Nor should you. It's fine.
Yes. So, you have any other notes or thoughts on these 3 chapters?
Nope, that's about it.
All right. Well, I will take us into chapter 39, which is the last Mat point of view in The Crown of Swords. All right, chapter 39 is entitled Promises to Keep. Back inside the Terrasen Palace, Mat is trying to convince everyone to hurry up and leave. But they sat in a room with Tylin, looking as if they had all the time in the world. Elaine and Nynaeve, looking to have somehow bathed and changed clothes. When did they get time for that? Anyway, they're there with the Aes Sedai, almost 20 of the Othan Mier, and a group of the kinswomen, all just sitting there as if a murderous, power-wrought, second-generation Terminator were not after them. After Mat, in particular. So now the Aes Sedai were beginning to question his story, as if several of the kinswomen and several of his men had not been killed by the thing, as if Elaine and Nynaeve hadn't seen the golem. But wait, Nynaeve and Elaine weren't really saying much about it. In fact, they seemed to be just waiting quietly while he floundered with the Aes Sedai and the Windfinders. Once again, Mat took the information given to him from Brigitta and summarized the story to everyone in the room. That during the War of Power, the Forsaken had made 6 golem, 3 which appeared female and 3 which appeared male, and these creatures were designed to hunt down and kill anyone who could channel. They can sense the One Power, they can sense people who use the One Power, but they cannot be touched by it themselves. They are impervious to it. They look human, but have no bones and can squeeze in under a door and are tremendously strong. This one must have been stored away in a stasis box since that time, and has been retrieved and awakened by one of the Forsaken. It was sent here to kill Nynaeve and Elaine Sedai, Mat-Tylin himself, though he did not need to tell them that, and it was sent to retrieve the Bowl of the Winds. The Forsaken knew far too much about what was going on in Ebou Dar. So, as if that were not enough, some of the Black Aja had been with them. So you have Black Aja, Forsaken, Golem. Hey, everybody, we need to get out of Ebou Dar now. We need to go someplace unknown, someplace that none of these bad guys know where to find us. But no one seemed willing to believe him. They listened, but they didn't seem ready to do anything. Then Matt started reading the people in the room. That was hard to do with Aes Sedai, who controlled their emotions so well, but he did it. Everyone seemed a little bit nervous and hiding it, except for the sea folk. Ah, so they were the problem. Matt stalked over to the wayfinder for the mistress of the ships, Ranile, and explained to her that he was not afraid of women who could channel. When she began complaining, Matt insulted her with something he had from his old memories, so she drew a knife and tried to stab him, but he grabbed her knife away, pushed her back into her chair, and presented his own bargain to her. It goes like this, quote, "You go where Nynaeve and Elaine want, and in return, I won't tie the lot of you across horses like pack saddles and haul you there," end quote. She agreed, looking shocked, and commented, quote, "I think I've just made a bargain with a Taveran," end quote. Then, as if a dam had broken, everyone began flooding out ideas of where they should go. In a moment, Rianne mentioned the hidden farm that the kin kept just a few miles away, to which Nynaeve and Elaine both agreed. A little too quickly. Yeah, everyone agreed, and the bustle started as they began making preparations, and Matt pulled those two aside, intending to berate them for having used him this way, but they apologized for it first. Still, he guessed that their last bargain they had made with the sea folk had turned out badly. So he left, met up with Tom and Julian, who had already packed his things for him, and went to gather Oliver and the band. One problem. Oliver was missing. When everyone offered to help find him, Matt insisted that the girls, Aes Sedai, Wayfinders, everyone who could channel, go ahead. Get the Bowl of the Winds out of here. It's too important. We'll find Oliver, then we'll ride to the farm. Fanning out across the city, they searched for the boy in a red coat, until Matt was startled by the sound of thunder in the harbor. When he climbed up where he could see, great ribbed-sailed ships were coming in hard. Seanchan. Suddenly it seemed like there were soldiers all through the city, fighting in several places, hard to get away from, and then Damane were ripping Tylin's soldiers into pieces. The power was being flung about several places, and Matt dodged into an alley when the Foxhead Medallion grew cold, then looked up just as the wall of the building next to him collapsed on top of him.
Wow, so what a way to take out one of our favorite characters in a cliffhanger. I can only imagine how frustrating this had to be to read it the first time through when you don't have the next book with you, or then when Path of Daggers comes out and you read it all the way through and there's still no Matt and you have to wait for Winter's Heart. I can't imagine, because I had these all on audiobook and on paper, so I could, quickly get through them in both formats, and I just feel very privileged that I started reading the series at such a time when it was all finished and I could do that, because wow, that had to be so so frustrating.
Right, and I didn't really think Matt was dead, but the fact he did not show up for an entire book made me worried just a little bit.
Yeah.
Until I got to that point. Yes.
And then Oliver, do we know of Oliver's status in that book either, or do we have to wait until Matt's POV comes back?
Oh yeah, we wait until Matt's POV. We have nothing else in Ebou Dar until we get back to Matt. And by the time they get back to him in Winter's Heart, which several chapters into Winter's Heart, things have already been settled with the Seanchan. People are adjusting to the new way of life. Matt is learning work the kinks out of his broken leg. That's healed pretty much by that point.
Oh, yeah.
Healed naturally because the Damane don't go around healing people the way the Aes Sedai try to do. So it's been a while, been a frustrating time for him. But most of the band is together and fine after that. I say the band along with Tom and Julian. They're there, but and again, that's where I am in my current reread. But a lot of fun and interesting things, and some of that gets mixed up in my mind with what's happening now before the Seanchan attack.
Yep.
But a lot of fun times we've got ahead of us here with Matt in Ebou Dar. The one note I made on this one, this is the only one I have. It's not that there weren't a lot of good things in this one, but I'll talk about this and then I'll let you go on and talk about whatever you want to with it, is that we talked about before, the sexual tension between Elaine and Matt. Or I think it's mostly just on Matt's point of view, or at least that's what I pick up on. When, after the he kind of faced down the Windfinders, made the bargain with them, pulls Nynaeve and Elaine aside, and, they have a little back and forth. They just apologize before he can say anything. Hey, sorry we had to use you like this, but, we felt like some things needed to be worked out. And he guessed that they had made a previous deal with the Windfinders that did not turn out well at all. And when he guessed that, of course, Nynaeve kind of blushes, and Elaine murmurs something about I don't remember, a very good subject, a very knowledgeable subject, something about, he being Andorran is, really sharp-witted to catch that. And he thinks to himself, and this is a quote, being in her good books might turn out less comfortable than being in her bed. End quote. Now, that is the most blatant reference to, at least he's thought about it. At least he's kind of, and he knows she's Rand's, and he never makes a move on her. He never flirts with her. He never says or does anything to even move that direction. It's like he's not going to do that because he knows her heart belongs to Rand. But she's pretty, and he's thought about it. At least it's crossed through his mind. And of course, I never would have caught that before, and without us going this in depth into this, or wouldn't have paid any attention to it, I guess. But now with the things we've discussed before, the little subtle hints you see, he at least is very physically attracted to Elaine.
Yeah, for sure. I like that tension between them. I don't know that she's attracted to him, but they do have this sort of friendly banter going on. It's hard to know what things are like from her perspective, because I don't know if we have many Elaine points of view in this book. I think when we switch to the girls, it's mostly from Nynaeve's perspective.
Right. And when we do have Elaine perspectives, I don't recall many of them that are Elaine's perspective in Mat's presence.
Right.
More of them are Elaine's perspectives, with Rand or with just she and Nynaeve and Egwene. But I'm not saying there aren't any, but there are none that are memorable enough to stand out to me at this moment.
One thing that really stood out to me from this chapter that came up several times is Mat's realizing how responsible he is now and how much of an adult he really is. He's surprising himself with it. Now, we have noticed some of these changes in him before now, like towards the beginning of Lord of Chaos, we started to see many of these, but he had not really consciously acknowledged them, apparently. Right. So there's at one point early in the chapter when they're still kind of wandering through the Rahad before they even get into the building with the storeroom. And he says, well, the wheel weaves, in response to someone else, that when he's worrying about the rough places that he might have to take the women in for shelter in case it starts storming. Right. So he is wanting to just keep going instead of stopping for the storm and just will risk it or whatever. But he's also thinking about how he wants to protect the women from going into these seedy places. And he sort of mentally berates himself. He says now he's sounding like, as he put it, some gray hair resting his aching joints in front of the fireplace because he's worrying about other people. Before, he might have sent them into a bar like that as a joke. He would have loved to see Elaine especially cringe at some kind of dive bar, which she probably wouldn't have. He's actually expecting that she would, but she loved jumping into danger. But this whole wow, I sound old thing, I think seems like a pretty common experience for people in their 20s. As we have to start adulting and we might begin to notice similarities with our parents. And Mat seemed like the type that would never really grow up. I think he thought that way about himself, and most observers, readers, and in-universe people who know him thought the same thing. But we're starting to see some really developmentally appropriate maturing here and reflection on that. He's noticing, wow, I'm growing up and I'm starting to sound old.
Right. And I think, like you said, everyone hits that occasionally.
Yeah.
I didn't see that in myself until I had children. And I remember when it was just you, since you're my oldest child, when you were fairly young and I would begin telling you things, I would say the words, but I would hear my father's voice. And I knew I was repeating exactly, word for word, things that had been said to me. And it's shocking when that happens. It was so strange. Of course, later those things and terms and all became mine, and I only hear my voice. But at first, I would hear my father's voice, and it's so shocking because I didn't intend that. I didn't sit back and study it and say, well, what would my father have said? It's like instinct. It comes out, you say it, and then there's a shock of, oh my gosh. That is exactly word for word what my father said to me. And it's very weird to experience that. As I said, it doesn't last long, but that's just part of that maturation process. It does not have to be your interaction with your children. It can be interaction with other people. But there are times when you hit this point where you realize I am not a child anymore. I'm not a teenager anymore. I am an adult, and you start saying and doing adult things, and it catches you off guard because you don't feel like you've made those changes, but emotionally and outwardly, you really have made those changes.
Yeah. I don't know that I would have noticed that much in myself around age 22-ish, which is what I think Matt is here, but it also depends on what kind of responsibilities you have at a certain age. So Matt is in command of an army in his early 20s, whereas I feel like I didn't start a lot of my more adult milestones. Still not in command of an army, but, we'll wait and see.
Right.
I didn't start a lot of those adult milestones later, which is a lot more common in Western culture now. We have this like long emerging adulthood where we're pursuing education or putting off having kids and that kind of thing. So I've noticed over the past year of being married and living with a partner for the first time, noticing sounding like one of y'all at some point. I'm like, oh, I'm becoming my mother, So it's interesting because those are the contexts I'm starting to see it come out.
Yes. It's there before, but it's not as flagrant. It's not as noticeable. And as you said, as you assume more responsibilities.
And we're not self-aware enough to see it until,
Right. And a lot of times you have to see the pattern of it. As you said, you were making a lot of adult decisions before, but now you see the same patterns again that you saw from your parents and repeat some of that. So it's kind of cool. Another, or I guess a couple more things where I didn't make notes on this, but it came to me as we were speaking of seeing Matt's maturity in this. One is the information he had about the Golem. All of that information came from Brigitte.
Oh, yeah.
He had no memories concerning the Golem, nothing. But she had some old memories about it, how when they were created, everything about them, about stasis boxes, and of course the wayfinders, are so incredulous because the Aes Sedai know nothing about any of this. They've never heard of Golem. They've never heard of stasis boxes, and so since they don't believe it, the wayfinders they're way off the charts, so to speak, disbelieving of him, and just they don't know why he's even in the room. So I do like though that he thought to himself as an aside that how he had gotten all that information from Brigitte, and that he would never reveal that even under hot irons, even under torture. He would never reveal that she's the one that told him that. Now, the old Matt, he did not have that level of loyalty to anybody. But the fact that Brigitte is a friend, and she's the not the romantic interest, but just a friend. She's the one person who knows his secret that he can relate to. And so he has so much loyalty to her. And I just find it so refreshing. You've talked before about the relationship, how much you felt like he needed that type of friendship with someone, and not just see women as sexual objects, but as people. And so I like seeing that, but he took that step from accepting who she is, guarding each other's secrets, to that level of loyalty, and he'd take it very seriously. So I like that about him. I like that maturity, that he wouldn't just on a whim decide to mention the wrong thing to the wrong people. So yeah, I think that's very, very grown up about our Matt. The other thing is the way he took charge of the room. Now, he did it out of anger, but at first it was as if he had the idea, okay, I'm just here to inform the Aes Sedai so they can make the right decisions. And then they just sit there looking at him. They don't really believe him. They're questioning his story. And of course, Nynaeve and Elaine had somehow kind of set this up amongst themselves to let him stew for a little bit. He thought it was just to get even with him, but really it was because they needed to guide people in the right direction, and they were using him to do that, which is a very Aes Sedai thing. No offense intended there. But he suddenly realizes, hey, I'm the only man in the room. They've set all the others out. And all these women, it's like they're just intent on scrambling my brains and beating my head against a wall. And he began to realize that he was placed in that situation, that he was being used. But rather than going off on a tangent about it, rather than getting angry at Nynaeve and Elaine, he decides, okay, if I'm stuck in this situation, I'm going to use that. Let's look around. Who is the most nervous here? Who is having the hardest time with this? Who is the problem in this room? Not me. And it's not just that all the women are against me, but there's another faction here. And once he zeroed in on that, now he did let his anger guide him in saying some very rude things to the wayfinder of the mistress of the ships, but it was necessary. He had to rattle her. He had to show that she was not in control of that room, because she felt like she was, and until she moved, nobody else really could move. So I did like that, because it took. We keep talking about this level of maturity, and I hate that word because I've overused it so much. But it took a lot of responsibility for Mat to stand back and study the situation, even though he was already angry, because that's difficult to do, to not let your emotions control you, and see what else is going on, see what undercurrents were there, and then find a way around those to get everybody moving, because ultimately he was saving their lives. That's what it came down to.
Yeah.
He was saving their lives by getting them moving, getting them out of Ebou Dar, getting them to some place where nobody would think to look for them. And that was very necessary at that moment. Now, unfortunately, he and his men did not make it out before events overtook them, but it was important that the Bowl of the Winds and most of these ladies who could channel get out of that city. So, congratulations, Mat. You did it.
Yeah. I think this scene shows key aspects of his character that seem like they're in opposition. And we talked about this from the very first Mat point of view chapter, from our first episode of this season, that he thinks things through thoroughly, we'll say. He tries to think about every option, every way out, and he consciously does that. His thoughts might follow a different pattern than, say, Perrin's when he's trying to do the same thing. Perrin wants to think things through slowly, right? Mat wants to think things through, but he's going to jump to a conclusion with his actions fairly quickly in most of these cases. He does not like to sit around and be idle and be bored and think about things too long. So he analyzes the situation. He does find this weakest link. He doesn't really think too much about his strategy of how to intimidate her. That's where he lets his impulsiveness take over. And that's the part of Mat that people see from the outside, and they think that makes up his whole character. They don't see those calculations happening under the surface that kind of lead up into this outward burst of action, which is his conclusion to the matter. So it's sort of like all his thoughts that led up to him blowing the horn or something like that. When we finally got a peek under the hood with that flashback point of view, we saw that there was a thought process that led up to it, but from the outside it looked very impulsive. So there's a combination there between his strategic thoughtfulness and his ability to just let his body kind of go with the flow and let his body move him into action. And that was interesting to see here. And I didn't really understand what was happening until it had already happened, and I had forgotten these plot details from my first read through, so it was interesting to see. And it's not even his we've talked about a couple of these are still not the only points of responsibility he shows in this chapter either. So earlier in the chapter, after the fight in the storeroom, or in the building that has the storeroom in it, and they lose many of their people, including Nelesian, Mat consciously thinks about his responsibility to the men that he commands. And he consciously thinks about how responsibility and Mat Cauthon, those two things seem completely anathema. It's at odds with who I thought I was. And we knew that he was becoming more responsible, but it was just interesting to see him finally realize it and have this moment of acceptance and acknowledgement of something that he used to deny. He didn't really, it seemed like he didn't overthink too much about what he was doing with the Seafolk Wave Mistress, but it's another example of him demonstrating that responsibility. He's kind of owning his authority now, I guess you could say.
Yeah, because otherwise it's something that can be easily squandered if you can't quantify it, identify it, accept it, and use it. Then he could definitely squander that and lose all credibility with those people. So
yeah,
I'm glad he did. Well, some fun chapters. That's all I've got on it. How about you, LaJara?
Yeah, same.
Well, if everyone would please join us next week as we delve into chapters 15 and 16 of Winter's Heart.
Subscribe to Wheel of Mind on Podbean, Stitcher, Google Play, Apple, Spotify, or you can find us on YouTube under the name Lajara Dane, LaJaradayne, to get notified when a new episode drops every Wednesday. We'd also love it if you could leave us some feedback, so rate or review us on your preferred podcast listening platform, or contact us through email at lajaradane@gmail.com, or on Twitter @mind_wheel. This is not the ending, but this is an ending to the turning of the Wheel of Mind.
Warp 4, head full, engage. Oh, and here's another quote that you probably don't even want to put in after show, but the wheel weaves as the Steve wheels.
Okay. Oh, yeah. No, that's a good one. We'll put it in there. This will date our episode of being firmly within Steve Gate. It's an important cultural marker for the fandom.
It's so funny to hear people go on and on about Steve. And now, one thing that someone pointed out on one social media site was that early on, Perrin, they put his name as like Paul or something. And it was probably just for a few days, but it started with the same letter, so it's the code name. So a lot of people are looking at this person's picture and they're trying to theorize, is this perhaps Samael or someone else whose name starts with an S? Now, with our luck, it's Baal Doman or something.
Right.
But, still a good, as good a theory as I've heard. But yeah, I just think it's funny. You have, all those new casting announcements and Steve. You're like, who the heck is Steve? But now some people have pointed out there is a warder named Stephen. Yes, and I don't remember the name of the Aes Sedai whose warder is. I would have to look it up again. But some people who are really deep into the lore of the Wheel of Time has pointed that out. There is a warder named Stephen. So
yeah.
Yes, we have some possibilities there, but I seriously doubt that's who this is. Again, I think it's code name.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, do we need...
yeah, for sure. His face looks like a Baal Doman to me, now that you say that. But I don't have any
think of early
good
characters.
guesses.
It might be, but I couldn't think of anyone else. But Samael, he does have a bit of a sinister look, or it appears that he could have if he wanted. So, let's see. I think we can.
Well, there's been confirmations of a few others that were a little more unofficial. So somebody tweeted at Daryl McCormick, because he had been cast a while back, but nobody knew who he was, who he's cast as. Sort of like there's also one that, we used to think was Sawan, and now some people think Elida, and the woman with the blue eyes, Maria Doyle Kennedy. Anyway, both of them actually tweeted stuff that gave clues. So, Daryl McCormick responded to one of the fans who tweeted at him, who said, tell us who you are already. And he said, I'm living that tinker life. And he put two emojis. One of them looked like an elf, kind of, and the other one looked like a little short sword.
I think it may be Aram.
So people think he's Aram now. He could just be messing with us, but many of the actors aren't necessarily familiar with the series that well, right? So they might not know an alternate character to tease us with. So, and then another one was that Maria Doyle Kennedy just responded with a smiley face emoji when somebody tweeted one of the pictures of her, kind of like you show me the Elida picture with the Make America Great Again hat on. So they tweeted one of those at her, and she just put a smiley emoji underneath it, and that's got a lot of people kind of stroking their chins, raising some eyebrows, thinking, maybe she actually is Elida then, like you've been saying.
I think we can put to rest.
I've been thinking Suwan, but now that they cast young Suwan as black, I'm sure that's not the case.
We put that one to rest about Siwan, because I'm still not sure who is playing Siwan, but it will not be Maria Doyle Kennedy unless they're really good with makeup. I don't see them doing that one. So, and I still, now she may play any number of characters because she is a great actress. I like Maria Doyle Kennedy, but in my rereads, I've begun to picture her face and her voice for Elida, and I really cannot picture anything else now. If she plays a different role, it will just destroy my world. It'll be so difficult.
Yeah.
I'll have to go through the entire series again with another actress's face there. Uh,
I tend to see the picture of the Twitter avatar for the main Elida roleplay account. I'll have to send
yes.
it to you and show you, but that's how I tend to see a lot of these people. Like there's a Gowan on there who's a very active role player too, and she's picked an actor from some other fantasy or medieval series or something. I don't actually know who it is, but the actor has been that person's avatar for so long that's how I see Gowan, and I can't unsee that anymore. Oliver too has been like the kid from Mad Magazine for a long time, so I can't unsee that.
Oh my goodness. Newsom. Oh, I can't remember the name. Alfred Newsom.
I don't know.
Yeah, Alfred E. Newman. There we go. Well, it's going back to my childhood. That's many years ago. Alfred P. Newman, Alfred E. Newman, something like that. I'll have to look that up. Oh, how funny. Yeah, so I always struggled with the Aes Sedai agelessness. So many of them I pictured as being older, and I always pictured Elida as being somewhat matronly. Slightly plump, definitely little touches of gray in her hair. I don't know why, I just always did. Because she had such an aura of strength and someone who is in control, and I always picture that as someone who's older, who's had years to gain all this confidence and strength and know who they are. So I just naturally pictured her that way. I always pictured Varen as being very grandmotherly. If they choose someone, and of course she's described as being plump with Varen, so yeah, if they have Varen as some skinny 25-year-old, it will ruin the entire series for me at that point again. But yeah, just again, some of that I just had pictures in my head. Moiraine was more or less what you saw in the cover art of the Eye of the World. Lan as well. The others less so, but because they were so weird and indistinct looking. But those two, definitely from the cover art. But it was still somewhat cartoonish. It wasn't as real. And seeing these characters, these people, where you can picture their voice, you can hear the inflections because you've seen them in so many different things. That I'm really getting into the casting and adding these characters into my head canon. And it brings so much more realism. So I'm enjoying the casting results. Of course, some of them I would not have chosen, but then again, I'm really not good enough to make shows, so it really doesn't matter what I think or whether or not I would have chosen them. For me, it's not so much the racial aspect. They seem to be handling that fairly well, working it in ways that it just makes sense. So I'm good with that. It's some people, I guess I just pictured them with a certain look, and it's hard to get that out of your mind. And I think all of us have done that to a degree, and that's why there's controversy over some of the casting choices. But I'm a firm believer that 1 or 2 years after the series has come out and become popular, that most people, they will have a hard time remembering how they used to picture these characters. Again, that's assuming this is well done. I think it will be. I think it'll be very much, again, as I use my analogy, the Lord of the Rings. I picture the characters, the actors, as those characters, and I can't really picture them any other way anymore. So, and that's a good thing. I like it. Yeah,
same. Harry Potter did that for me too. That's another one where I read the books, some of the books first before the movies started coming out. I saw a meme a while back, and this has probably been a few months ago, but there was a meme circulating on Twitter that was talking about racial casting in fantasy TV shows especially. It said something like, here in our medieval fantasy kingdom, we do have one black person, and he is our captain of the guard. And they had screenshots from like 4 or 5 different shows, and that was always the case. They would have one black character, but he was always the captain of the guard. And The Witcher was one of those that broke that up differently. Like there's people of all different colors, just kind of all over the place. And even when their characters weren't necessarily described that way, because it was written by a Polish guy in Poland, so everybody would have looked white probably if he had cast them. But it didn't change anything about the story, right? Like the person's skin tone didn't really matter for their character. So it ended up giving a lot of actors opportunities they might not have had in medieval casting to be somebody other than the captain of the guard. And seeing how The Witcher pulled that off very well, I'm hoping that the Wheel of Time, it looks like they're going in a direction like that, where a lot of actors might be getting roles that they might not have been able to do before, or they might, because people tend to get very typecast, and also giving fans of fantasy who are non-white more people to see folks that look like them in their media, which tends to be kind of rare. So I'm just excited about it.
Yeah. And the first author I remember who brought in different racial or different ethnicity within the series that stood out to me was Ursula K. Le Guin.
Oh yeah, I've started reading her stuff.
Earthsea.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, the Earthsea, and again, she didn't make a big deal out of it. It's just so many of the characters, she described them as with different ethnicities, and I've heard other people talk about how much that meant to them, just to have someone that looked like them, and Jordan did that, but I had a hard time picturing them the way he described them. And I think a lot of that goes back to the Tolkien-esque view of fantasy.
Oh, yeah.
That it was, let's face it, I love Tolkien's works, but it was very white. And I don't say that as being either good or bad. It's just a fact. It was written that way from the era in which he wrote it, the perspective in which he wrote it. It just was. So. But I had a habit of picturing characters a certain way. And as I've said before, my first time through The Eye of the World, I pictured Egwene as being blonde. Yeah. And I don't know why. She was very clearly described as having black hair, and most everyone in the Two Rivers was tanned much darker than Rand was. And, it's one of those things that is... He described it one way, but I continually pictured it in my mind. I guess because you start with a name,
right,
and you don't start with a full image.
Yeah, and her name looks kind of Germanic or something, and so based on fantasy you've read before, where like a lead woman love interest might be blonde, like you're just going to go ahead and superimpose that when that's what you're used to.
Right. Yeah, just that habit of throwing that in there. So when I went back and saw, whoa, she's got black hair. And then you really read the descriptions of a lot of people, and he doesn't hit you over the head with it, but he does describe them as very, various ethnicities among various peoples and cultures and groups, and it's not a big deal because in that world it's not a big deal,
right?
People are divided up by different countries, but not necessarily different races.
Yeah.
And I like that sort of a homogenous feel to it. That we're all people, and we do have some Ogier over here, and they're not people, but we are all people. So we're just, it's not a big deal to much of anybody. You have some groups like the Athan Mir, whom I still picture as being very much as being from the continent of India. Yeah. That
they are described very dark, which many people had equated with being maybe West African, but they're always described with straight hair, which makes that kind of incongruous. So that's why I would think South Asia maybe too.
That, and with the jewelry, the chain from the nose to the ear with medallions on it, very very much like some of the wedding medallions from the Indian culture. So and so I love picturing them that way. Whether or not they're shown that way in the show, we'll find out. But it seems like they tended to kind of isolate themselves, not intermarry with drylanders. We saw how the Aiel, the Vikings of the desert, did not intermarry with wetlanders, and so you had a few groups that were divided out, kind of ethnically, but not many. Among most of the other countries, Carianan were short, but you have Carian of various skin tones, and Terrans, people from Tyr tend to be a little taller, and they tend to be a little darker. You have, a lot of darker skin tones there. Not everyone is what we think of as African American or Aboriginal or whatever other name you want to put with it, but they just have that tendency. And so there are some people you can look at them and tell where they're from, but most of them you have to tell by the way they're dressed and the way they talk. And I just enjoy that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's certainly refreshing for its time, for the genre, and I think it's a good time to be adapting a show of it too.
Yeah. So so I'm really excited for the show. I think we've got a lot of great things in store. It appears that they're handling it well, and I hope all of our listeners will one day be viewers and will love this as much as we do. And I just enjoy seeing the fandom grow. I've seen a little bit more toxicity here lately. I think it's just because more people are coming in. This has been a very close knit group, but still, that's not a bad thing. It's just what it is.